When you go to a wedding, when you meet a classmate from high school that you haven't seen in 30 years, how do you describe your job to people?
Well, if it was high school, it's funny. I used to be the set designer for the theater group, so this wouldn't be too big of a departure from how they knew me back then. Um, but I always like to say that my work basically tells you something about the characters that the script can't say with words, and we create a visual subtext for the story.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like it's an unsung, part of the process.
Mhm.
People think of the actors, they think of the director, and they don't realize probably how closely you are working with the director or directors in the case of television, often to try to, like you say, meet those themes that are necessary for each and every episode. But I have to ask, your career has encompassed so many different spheres, from entertainment to the stage, in television, feature films, whatever it might be. And obviously, most recently, you're the production designer for the streaming program Shrinking on Apple TV. So, what appealed to you most taking on this particular project?
Well, the story, most of all, I was actually doing a pilot for HBO last year or 2 years ago with Eva Longoria as our director, called the Gordita Chronicles, and it was uh, a story about immigrants coming to the U.S. back in the '80s and fish out of water story. Um, they came from the Caribbean to Miami, and it was a story that was perfectly suited for Eva because she is such a champion of diverse stories and storytellers, and she's really come into her own as a director now. I have to say, I've been doing this a long time, and she is really the most prepared director I think I've ever worked with. I mean, she's super passionate. She carries the whole production on her shoulders and gets it all done, and motivates and inspires all of us to do our best work. So I was on that show with her, and towards the end of it, she came up to me and she said, "I'm doing um, a, a, a feature about uh, the guy, the janitor who invented the Frito Lay flaming hot Cheeto."
Yeah.
And so, she brought me along to that production. We shot that in New Mexico, and then when I came back, I got the call from Bill Lawrence about Shrinking, and so it's been a very interesting last couple of years. I've been involved in a very kind of mixed and varied group of productions, ranging from super high budget with superstar cast to low budget with a lot of unknowns. And for me, it's all about the story. If the storytelling is, as Michael Douglas used to say, if it ain't on the page, don't engage. And so I just, I can tell a few pages into a script whether it's something I can bring something to or not.
Yeah, and with a show like Shrinking, it feels like the most challenging part might be creating a design aesthetic that is complementing both the drama and the comedy that is present in the series. Was that something that you like jump into and say, "Oh, this is a great challenge. I'm excited about this"? I mean, I assume with most projects you would, but like, what is going through your mind when you have to kind of balance those two in your production design?
Well, in this case, with Shrinking, we wanted it to be grounded in reality. It's a story about a man who's, you know, in grief, and even though it has comedic elements, we didn't want to take you out of the emotional sort of foundation of the story. Uh, it was decided pretty early on that um, we would set this in Pasadena, and I don't recall any show, at least in the recent few, recently, that's been set in Pasadena. You see a lot of shows, that are LA or Hollywood and um, West Side and all that, but Pasadena became like a real character in the story, and so we focused on that. But essentially, it became a story about it was decided that because Jason Segel, who's an exec producer on the show as well, was very involved in all the creative discussions early on. And with James Ponsoldt, our director, the two of them kind of came up with this idea that, we're going to tell a story about a man who's in the darkness and he emerges out of the darkness over 10 episodes. So essentially it's a 5-hour movie about a man who's, we find him in his house with all the drapes drawn and he's not taking care of himself. He's not taking care of his daughter. And then as the show goes on, things start to open up, physically and emotionally.
Yeah, and I'm curious because obviously, you have quite a history in television and being on a series for a long period of time. You're the production designer for the full run of Spin City and Scrubs,
Mm-hmm.
the series that ran for years and years. So in this case, you're talking about, okay, a 10 episode, it's very fixed. They know what they're trying to accomplish that. But when you're on like a long running, sitcom, how does that differ in terms of after you've created the initial look and design of the series? What is keeping you occupied in the years and years that continue on?
Well, once you fill out your stages with the permanent sets, which are, really the home base for each of the key characters, whether it's a working environment or a residential, domestic environment, every episodic script brings some new challenge, whether it's a location or a stage set. Whether it's dinner at a restaurant or a party or somebody goes shopping at a store. In the case of Shrinking, we had Sean climbs up on the water tower in episode 4, I think it was. And we had some challenges with that location. So we had to actually build the water tower on stage. And, we had about 3 days notice to get that pulled together. So there's always a fire drill. Every week there's some kind of fire drill that has to be pulled off. And I actually met Bill Lawrence on Spin City, back in the 90s. So we go back like 30 years now, which is kind of nuts. And then he brought me to California from New York to do Scrubs. And so I've watched him over the years develop this incredible kind of ability to take the audience from these moments of just exuberant joy to suddenly you turn the corner and you got a lump in your throat or you're crying, and it's not something that you see done very deftly like he does. And so I think Shrinking has really kind of taken all those years of our experience and put them into this one vehicle, in a way that suddenly this is a show that a lot of people need right now.
Yeah, well, it's really
Uh,
interesting too, because obviously, like Jason Segel himself, his career, the very beginnings, feels like it was very much based in this same type of tone and attitude, like you say, mixing the comedy and the tragedy. A lot of people say they kind of go hand in hand when in storytelling in general, but just that the real emotion that comes through and that sincerity. So I am curious though, going back just a little bit earlier in your career, because you got to work in music videos, and I find this fascinating, and lots of MTV programming and things like that. So with something like the CNC Music Factory, things that make you go or the LL Cool J's 6 Minutes of Pleasure, they have such a distinct visual style. And honestly, they look like they would be at home in a trendy art gallery in New York of that era. So I'm curious, going back to that time, is there a major connection that you recall between just the New York art scene and then how those things were being presented in, connected with music in a music video format?
Absolutely. I mean, there was I think at that time in the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, there was I guess I'd call it a graphic movement. You had Pee-wee's Playhouse was on with Gary Panter's work, and there was a keen interest to, you know, kind of celebrate postmodernism and things that had a real graphic style to them. So in the case of CNC Music Factory, I started working with Marcus Nespel, who was a young director. He had come to New York from Germany. I think he was right out of art school, actually. And we started his company in a 2-bedroom apartment in Chelsea. I mean, it was literally like we were doing just commercial after music video after commercial there. And he had this real sort of visual sense of things. He did the 6 Minutes of Pleasure video. He did CNC Music Factory. I did a lot of commercial work with him. He later went on to do the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Conan the Barbarian. But I worked with a lot of directors, young directors back then, who were, inspired by the same kind of visual graphics, and that was really kind of our focus. Is to do something that caught your eye. Like if you were turning the channel, you knew exactly where you were and what world you were in.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's those types of things that, they might be considered of the moment, but then at the same time, you're like, but no, like this was its own thing that really, continues on. If you look at it today, you're just like, wow, it is an artistic expression beyond just, oh, we want to make the artist look good, right, on screen. And I'm curious, do you feel like you've noticed a bigger change more towards, again, less of infusing those types of more creative side of things, is just like, well, let's just present a beautiful person and their song, or present a beautiful person as they're performing in this production? Like, has there been a big change since that period?
Well, I'm sort of 100% focused now on narrative work, so I don't really do the occasionally I'll get a commercial here and there, but I'm mostly focused on scripted material. Just from my own observations, I think a lot of what's going on today, revolves around some kind of visual gag. There's, you need some kind of visual hook to pull people in and to keep them there for 3-4 minutes. And I think, back when I was doing it, it was a little more about, of course, that was a priority, but it was about sort of creating almost like a moment you might find on stage. It was a little more performance driven.
Yeah, and speaking of which, so obviously you also worked for a lot of music performances and stage design. People like Mariah Carey and Backstreet Boys and Carly Simon and Kenny Loggins, like all in very different settings. But was there a particular project for you that you remember from a live stage design, for a musical performance, that maybe stands out to you, something that you felt creatively was very satisfying?
I think it was the Mariah Carey show. It was on NBC. It was a Thanksgiving primetime special. It was kind of a big deal at the time. That was the show that launched her. I was kind of Sony Music's music video designer back in those times, and Tommy Mottola, who was, he had a company called. A management company called Champion Entertainment. And so he managed Carly Simon, Taylor Dane, Hall & Oates, a lot of the big music acts back then. And then he became the head of Sony Music. And he started incubating all these artists, and one of them was Mariah Carey. And so nobody had heard of her then, and I certainly didn't know who she was, but I got to sit in on a few sessions where she was recording her first album, and I could just tell this was going to be something really amazing. And so what we did was we created a set that had 3 different acts, 3 different looks, inspired by a operatic set by Boris Aronson. I think it was Aida or something like that. And it was this very kind of monolithic, monumental, heroic stage set. And Larry Jordan, who was the director, did some fantastic things with lighting cues and things like that. So at the time, for me, that was really kind of, and remains to this day, I think, one of the things I'm really very proud of, because it combined my architectural experience, my theatrical experience, my film and television experience all into sort of this one production. And of course, the audience, it was at a theater up in Poughkeepsie, New York called the Proctor Theater. And the audience was just insane. They just were so into her and it's just so loud. You literally had to put earplugs in because the screaming, it was like the Beatles or something. It was just so intense. The
Wow.
only time I've experienced something, the only time I've experienced something equal to that in terms of decibel levels from an audience of girls was the Backstreet Boys. It's like,
That's amazing. And just
you,
to think that you were there at the beginning, like you're saying, you're really giving her like her first national exposure
yeah.
in a big way. That's amazing. I somebody else that you've collaborated with a few times that I'm curious to get your take on is Kevin Smith, because you worked with him on two very different films. They were just worlds apart in terms of tone. Like you handled the production design for his Thriller, essentially. It was a big unexpected kind of dramatic turn for him with Red State, and then five
Yes.
years later you're working together again on what you would call kind of like just a silly cartoonish film starring his daughter, Yoga Hosers. So how
Yeah.
would you compare those two experiences working with Kevin?
Well, Red State was kind of a dream come true for me because I've always loved Kevin's work. I always at that time wanted to be involved in the horror genre. Um, I grew up, just sort of obsessing about all the Universal classic monsters and just love that genre. And so to have that opportunity was fantastic. And the fact that it was sort of woven in with a very sort of timely topic in the news, which was this religious cult, uh, that were, anti-gay, anti-freedom, anti anything liberal. And I think Kevin found a way in with his script and it was just brilliant. And the challenge was we did the movie for I think $6 million. So there wasn't a lot of money and not very much time. So, I think what I'm very good at is um, you know, taking a challenging situation and creating ways to make every frame interesting. Like there's always something interesting backing it up or to look at. Um, so with Kevin, it was interesting because he was there every day. We had a location in Downey, which was a former campus of a reform school, and so it had like houses and prisons and gyms, and it had everything we needed there. We shot like 90% of the movie there. And he had his bus there. He has this fantastic, you know, souped up bus that he rides around in. And so we would shoot all day. He would go into the bus at night and he would edit all night and he would sleep there. And so we'd come in, 6 a.m. call the next morning and he'd be coming out of his bus, with his cup of coffee. And so by the end of the shoot, which I think was, I want to say 23, 25 days, something like that, he had the whole show cut together. And at the wrap party, he had a screening of the movie. It was like,
That is
so,
pretty.
that kind of explains, Kevin and how passionate he is about what he does. I think the Yoga Hosers was a very different experience. And by the way, Austin Butler was in that, who's being celebrated for Elvis right now. But that was one of his first movies. If you go back and look at it, he plays the love interest there. And of course, Johnny Depp's daughter. So I think it was kind of like, it was fun because it was like a family movie. It was like, it was just fun being around all the family and the kids and everything, and everybody was in it together. And Kevin's wife was in it, and so it was fun. It was a very bizarre film. I still don't know what to make of it, but
Well, I was gonna say you worked with some tiny monsters and these little sausage creatures and whatever else.
yes,
Like,
yeah, the hit ones. They were called
yeah.
the hit ones.
But I'm curious, just on the vein of, because obviously monster movies, the classic Universal monsters, and really horror in general, focuses so much on the, the production design makes or breaks a movie in a big way. Is there a character that, that's established that you would love to get a chance to help design a film for? Like, do you have a favorite of the classic monsters, or even an 80s horror icon that you'd love to work with?
I love all I think what Coppola did with Dracula was just incredible. I would love to do something similar with like Frankenstein, I think. A director I work with a lot, Paul McGuigan, who's Scottish, he did a Frankenstein movie, and I wish I had known him then. I could have had the opportunity, but
Okay, and let me ask you this then too, because I talk about these kind of more genre-inspired things. You did get a chance to be instrumental in Supergirl, the television
yes.
series, and creating the look of that series. So I have to ask, I'm a big comic book fan, so that's exciting to me to pick your
Me
brain.
too. I do graphic novels on the side.
Oh,
That's my side hustle. So
oh, great. Who do you kind of collaborate with on those?
it's interesting. I have a new little startup I'm working on called the Electric Book Wagon, and I'm working with like Hollywood screenwriters who have these scripts that, for whatever reason, don't get any traction as filmed properties, and so we're turning them into webisodes, sort of like webtoons, or it's all vertical scrolling.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm working with like Rob Kuttner right now from The Daily Show, and Conan, and John Kesselman, who I did the Hebrew Hammer with, and I have a couple of fiction novelists that we're working with. So it's a genre I'm very keenly aware of. And when we did Supergirl, um, it was such an honor to be part of that, because I did the pilot in the first part of the first season, and we really wanted to tell this story from a young woman's point of view, uh, in terms of lifestyle and politics. It wasn't just about you know taking care of the villain every week. It was really about sort of the struggles that a young woman goes through, kind of trying to find herself and become who she eventually is going to be. So that was a good one.
Yeah, did you enjoy getting a chance to mix in a little bit of kind of science fiction elements into your design? Because it seems like maybe in most of your career that hasn't been a major part of it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I grew up in a family. My dad was an engineer who worked in the space program. My mom was an artist. So I'm a pretty good combination of their interests. And uh, I was very happy and honored to do the sci-fi series Extant with Steven Spielberg and Halle Berry, where I got to kind of develop some very interesting kind of forward-looking, futuristic space travel stuff, but something that was very grounded in reality. And we got to deal with a lot of robotic engineers on that one. So I was able to bring some of that to Supergirl, and we had, you know, there was the conceit was that, um, you know, a big star fell to Earth with all these villains on it, and so there were literally hundreds of villains, kind of alien villains, sort of roaming the Earth, and each one of those was going to pop up in each episode as a new situation for her to deal with. Um, and so we got to deal with kind of extraterrestrial travel, but we also got to deal with some things on Earth, like a super train and some new technologies here that were, here to benefit uh, humans. But it was fun. I always kind of leaned into the DC universe rather than the Marvel one growing up, and I just love Batman and Superman, of course. But so for me, it was a big thrill, being able to go back to the origin story of one of those characters and tell it, because when she leaves Krypton, that was kind of a big moment in the pilot, and it was great creating all that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I gotta say, just nostalgically for me, I'm a huge fan of the 80s Supergirl film, as goofy
Mhm.
as it is.
Mhm.
So it was awesome that Helen Slater was
Yeah,
in those early episodes and everything. But I really enjoyed that series. You did a wonderful job just pulling all that together.
thank
Um,
you.
as we close out here, I did want to ask, because you've been in this industry long enough to see kind of the evolution of where maybe, prestige was attached to, theatrically released films, things of that nature, and television was kind of always on the lower tier and people didn't think so highly of it. And yet now we're kind of in an era where that has reversed in a lot of ways. People are staying home and paying attention to what is streaming into their homes, things like Shrinking, where you're like, wow, okay, you're getting a chance to celebrate this medium in a different way. What has kind of been your recognition of that along the way? Like, is there a particular point in time where you said, wow, okay, people are really paying attention to television more, and did that lead you to want to take on more television based projects, or it just in that genre?
Well, I love the feature format because you you get to tell a story. It's interesting. In you know 10-20 years ago, features were the long form, right? But now they're really kind of the short form, because you've only got 90 minutes plus to tell that story. But the thing I love about the television format is, as I said about Shrinking, we're telling a story that's essentially a 5-hour feature, and so you've got 10 episodes to create that arc. Um, and I've already heard sort of rumors about what they're doing for the second season, which will be equally interesting. It's taking Jimmy into kind of a new phase of his life. But with features, I guess I've never done any really huge budget shows, so it's hard for me to say how rewarding that might be. I've always done shows that are sort of 20 million and below. Most of them have been between 5 and 10. So it's a very immersive, passionate process where the director is completely invested, and there isn't really a studio because most of them are independent. So it's sort of like everybody's just kind of leaving us alone to do the best work that we can. Features is a much more director-driven environment, whereas television is really the showrunner runs everything. So it's much more producer writer driven, and I think there's pluses to both, but I don't. I think it's probably no accident that streaming is the king now, because the best stories are being told on television. It's and the fact that we all have, or people have the ability to have these huge screens in their home, or even you can get a projector now for $100 that will give you a pretty big screen. It's if you can have good sound with it, it's as good as going to the movies, really. I mean, it doesn't give you that communal experience, but I think the best stories really are being told on television now. So for designers like myself, it's a great opportunity to really do some great work.
Fantastic. And hey, we wish you all the best with Shrinking season 2. That's excellent to hear. There's already plans in place because people are really enjoying it. So again, thank you
Yeah.
so much for your time and sharing your experiences, because again, a fascinating career. So have a good one.
Thank you, Adam. Good to meet you.